Hi, my name is Paul, and I have the pleasure of taking you through Paul's letter to the Romans. Outside of the Gospels, Romans is the most formative and influential letter in the New Testament. It has changed the lives of so many people, and it is still changing lives today. Until you read it and study it and immerse yourself in it so you understand the big picture, you cannot grasp what Paul says, what he does in some of those profound, precious verses that we've all come to love and enjoy and cling on to. Now, Rome was the capital of the empire, the seat of the emperor, estimated around 1 million people. If you were to go to Rome today, the river Tiber, you'd see the river Tiber separate almost two halves of the city. On the upper half would be the 7 famous hills that John mentions in Revelation. But then down on the other side of the river, down in the low part, you see this riverbank where the lower class of people had been resigned to live in. And to this day, much of that has not changed too much. And this is the Roman church that Paul was writing to, where it was situated. Now, by tradition, the Roman church has been ascribed to the Apostle Peter, but has also been ascribed to some believers that were present in Acts 2, specifically Priscilla and Aquila. But Rome became the most affluent and generous church throughout church history. But it was not always like that. The physical look of the Roman church now looks radically different to the Roman church back then. Scholars and historians have determined that the Church of Rome made up about 5 to 8 house churches. And by conservative numbers, that's only around about 100 people in the capital city of 1 million. Now, within these house communities, scholarship estimates that around half were ex-proselytes, meaning that they were Gentiles who converted to Judaism but had now became Christian. They were made up of law-abiding Jewish Christians and uncircumcised Gentile Christians. In addition, you had those who were uncircumcised Gentiles who favored the monotheism of Judaism, and they worshiped on the fringe of the synagogue. They were 1 foot in the door converts to Judaism, but yet they were attracted to the Christian gospel experienced by the Jewish Christians. Now, Paul should be found in many academic departments other than theology or religion. His intellectual and spiritual footprint leaves its wake in history, in philosophy, in sociology, and in ancient literature. He is that influential. Paul was a Pharisee, and in Hebrew that means an expounder. The Pharisees were the leading Jewish religious authority in his day. He was a highly educated Pharisee. And as you know his story, he went from being a persecutor to a proclaimer, from expounding the law to expounding the gospel. The Old Testament he never loses sight of. He quotes the Old Testament in Romans more than any other book in the New Testament. There are over 75 quotations of the Old Testament by Paul. Now, Paul was a Roman citizen. We don't know exactly how Paul became a Roman citizen, but that reason is important is because Paul, being a devout Jew and a Roman citizen, made him the perfect candidate to be entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, the Gentiles, as he says in Galatians. Now, Paul's Roman worldview, mixed with his own Jewish worldview, did not give him license to dabble in either one, depending on what met his immediate needs. In Romans and in his other letters, we can see how Paul synthesized his two worldviews in light of the gospel to maximize his proclamation of the gospel. Paul was highly functional, highly educated, highly motivated, and highly zealous for God. And he would become highly zealous for Jesus, the Messiah. You know, of all his known works, he only wrote about 80 pages, but they are 80 pages of some of the most influential and inspirational works ever written. And just to think, he did it all without coffee. A scholar was giving a lecture on Paul, and he said, everywhere Paul spoke, there were riots and chaos. Everywhere I speak, they serve coffee and donuts. Now, that may seem rather comical, but in the day, that's what Paul's message, the gospel, produced. There's no doubt that next to Jesus, no other person in Christianity caused more arguments or disagreements than Paul. But in our current day, It seems only some of what Paul said, specifically about sexuality or gender, are the only topics that elevate such high levels of contention and controversy. Now, I have a saying that where the Gospels proclaim, the letters of the New Testament explain. They color in and elucidate how the gospel manifests itself in the lives of believers, in the church and in the world. All the implications and practices of the gospel are worked out and or demonstrated in the letters of the New Testament. So what was the purpose of this letter? Some say it was a theological treatise, his theological masterpiece, his swan song toward the end of his life. The other theory is that he says later in the book of Romans that he wanted to go to Spain. And at the time, his hub, if you will, of his ministry was based in Antioch. And perhaps he wanted to use Rome as his new hub. And then you have this Jewish-Gentile hostility. The Roman Emperor Claudius in 49 AD issued an edict to ban all Jews from Rome. And they were having these outbursts and riots that were primarily based upon a person named Christus, which is Latin. But in Latin, the I and the E are virtually synonymous, so they could be interchanged. So if you replace the E in Christus with an I, what do you get? You get Christus. So it's possible that these Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians were causing disruption within the social order, and that's why he issued this edict. But Claudius's successor, Nero, when he took the throne, eliminated that edict and allowed the Jews to come back to Rome. So you have this Gentile power vacuum that developed when the Jews were expelled. And when the Jews came back, it only further escalated existing Jewish-Gentile hostility. So you have these multicultural house churches made up of Jewish Christians and Gentiles with varying beliefs and practices. Some believe in this, some believe in that. Some adhere to this, some adhere to that. But that's what I mean. When the Jews returned, it further exacerbated already complex issues. In this letter, and like I said, the rest of the New Testament, Paul is desperately trying to smooth over, and shed light on what these people's newfound faith means for them individually and corporately. We'll see most of the time in the second half of Romans, but as we work through the first half, keep this point in the back of your mind. Now, many years ago, a tract or a little pamphlet came out called Romans Road to Salvation. And it's very truthful because it works through the first 8 chapters. And that's very true, but there's so much more that Romans is about. The gospel of God, as Paul calls it, means so much as more than how one simply goes to heaven or how one gets saved. Yes, it is a story of our salvation and justification. And it also speaks of our spiritual life, our sanctification, and how we relate to each other and to the world. But Romans is a symphony of 4 movements that encompasses the entire cosmos, all of creation. It tells the redemptive plan from Adam to glorification through God's faithfulness in dealing with his creation and how we are in turn to live in the light of the gospel with each other and with the world. Now, Romans is unlike any of Paul's other letters. He does not give any accounts, mainly like miracles, death, the resurrection, the Last Supper, like we see in the Corinthian letters. He does not elaborate on his own testimony, as we see in Galatians. And he does not give any defense of his ministry, as he does in a few letters. And he does not explicitly correct false teachings or issues as he does elsewhere. In fact, as much as he talks about what Jesus did, there's only one explicit reference to the cross. He is writing to a church with people that know and believe in Jesus and what he did, just like you. What is he doing then? He is writing to explain it all. The gospel, what it means and what the implications are. What it means for Jews, what it means for Gentiles, and what it means for the church. When we answer those questions, then we ask questions like, what does it mean for us? What are the implications for you and the church, for you and the world, and for you and Jesus? Whatever Paul's intent was in writing this letter, one thing for sure, Paul felt led by the Holy Spirit to evangelize in Rome. But like he said in Romans 15, he did not want to build on someone else's foundation. No, that was not his intent. What he wanted to do, or what he was led by the Spirit to do, was to declare the gospel as he saw it, or as he had received it, and as he had experienced it. If Rome was to be his new hub or base of ministry, they would need to hear from Paul himself what the gospel was, what it was for him, what it was for Jews and Gentiles, and what it meant for the world. Did you know that by 300, roughly 50% of the urban centers in the Greco-Roman world were Christian? And the rural areas, the countryside, and the villages were all pagan. As we know from our own modern experience, as the cities go, cultures go. As the cities go, societies go. Urban centers, more often than not, determine the political, philosophical, social, economic, and theological impulses that affect the society as a whole. The early missionaries and messengers were compelled by the Spirit to go to the urban centers and the cities. And what happened? Christianity spread like wildfire through the Roman Empire. This letter is one of the contributing factors that helped Christianity spread. Now, Romans is about God. God is mentioned more in Romans than any other book, over 160 times. And it's all about Jesus, the Messiah, 65 times. It's about the Holy Spirit, 30 times. It's about God's righteousness, 30 times. It is about his grace. Grace is used 155 times in the New Testament, and over 100 of them are in Paul's writings alone. And almost a fourth of those, 24 times, are in this book, Romans. You cannot grasp the meaning of this book if you don't comprehend God's righteousness and grace. We'll see it again and again. They are at the heart of the book, the heart of the gospel, and the heart of God. Romans is like a budding rose. For example, look at how this one arc develops throughout the book. The righteous shall live by faith. That's 1 verse 17. Being justified by faith, we have peace with God. Chapter 5, verse 1. And nothing will be able to separate us from the love of God. That's 8, verse 39. For there's no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. Chapter 10, verse 12. Therefore, welcome one another, just as Christ has welcomed you. Chapter 15, verse 7. Now, did you know that there's a historical event that points to the significance that this letter had on the Roman churches? In Acts 28, which occurs after this letter was delivered, Paul was arrested and taken to Rome to appear before Caesar. His friends, his brothers and sisters in the faith, come to escort Paul, their friend and brother in the Lord, into the city. Paul's reputation as a faithful servant and apostle for Jesus Christ preceded himself through this letter, and their gracious welcoming and comforting him in what seemed to be his last days confirms what this letter meant to them. Now, in this series, I'm going to seek to give you a summary of the text, not strictly verse by verse, but a summary to unlock the meaning and the flow of thought as we move through the chapters. 20th century Swiss theologian Karl Barth said, in the Church of Jesus Christ, there can and should be no non-theologians. Theology, which is the study of God, is not just meant for ministers, theologians, and academics. It's for all of us, because we are all theologians. If you hear or read some deep theological texts in the Bible, specifically in the New Testament, that trouble you, you're not alone. But think of it, the New Testament was written to first century people, and albeit there exists some ancient cultural norms or language anomalies that they would understand, the root or the heart of the message of the text, its intended meaning, is meant for us to read, hear, consider, and ponder as well, just like they did. Croatian theologian Miroslav Volf said, theology is not about understanding the world, it's about mending the world. That's what this series is meant to do, to help you, the theologian, mend the world as a set-apart messenger like Paul. Now, whether you're a new Christian or you've read Romans many times, it's my hope and intent that in this series I will not just give you a new, fresh appreciation for Romans, but a clear and working knowledge of Romans that brings you closer to Jesus And then in true gospel fashion, it compels you to tell others of this good news. One of my mentors in the faith said, you need to read the gospel, hear the gospel, and know that the gospel indicts you and then saves you. That is the intent of Romans to the original hearers and to us today. Do you want to know something? Believe it or not, the fact is, even if you've been going to church for a little while, you know more about Jesus and the gospel than the original recipients of this letter. So you already have enough of what you need to climb the ascent of this great book. So you're going to have a little homework. And for next time, I want you to read chapter 1 before you watch the next video, so you have it fresh in your mind. And then you can follow along as we go through. You can take notes, highlight, or whatever you want to do. So read chapter 1, and I'll see you in the next video.